talked some yesterday about security and ransomware and some of the trends. And today we're going to bring back Adam Scamihorn. Adam is the Resiliency Product Director here at InterVision. He's got 11 years with InterVision and 20 years experience in cloud and resilience. And I think I've known Adam pretty close to all those 11 years with InterVision. I was a customer of Adam's and then joined him. So with that, Adam, I'm going to toss to you to talk about ransomware is a disaster.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Let me share my screen here real quick. All right. You see my slide?
Yes, we do.
Awesome. So as Jeff mentioned, I am Adam Scamihorn. I've been doing business continuity, disaster recovery, and things centered around business risk for a pretty long time. And specifically for the last 5 or so years, really focused around cyber attacks, ransomware, and how it plays a part in all of the different ways we interface with different organizations. Before we dive into my discussion, I want to actually kick us off with a poll question. So if you take a look at the polls, we're going to ask you, what do you think the biggest perceived threat is to your business? And these are 4 of the leading ones out there. There's obviously lots of threats to everyone's organization as you measure risk. But of those 4, go ahead and rate what you think the #1 threat is to your business, and jump in there here before we close the poll out.
Hey Adam, it's Jennifer. I just want to give you a heads up. We're going to let it run for about a minute.
Okay.
You can tell dad jokes.
I can tell dad jokes?
Yeah, you can do impersonations. And then I'm going to give you a heads up when I think we've got a good sample set.
Sounds good. So while that timer goes on, I am not going to tell dad jokes. You're welcome. But I will jump into talking a little bit about ransomware as a modern disaster. And so I don't want this to be a conversation where we talk specifically around data points and a lot of fear and uncertainty. But what I'm going to do today is actually tell a lot of stories and talk about how we've seen people address this problem and how we're addressing this problem as we go through the conversation. And so one of the biggest things to note is when we talk about ransomware or cyber attacks, that this is not a technology problem. It's a business issue. And so when we have or see cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, it can involve more than just business downtime, but also data loss, like affecting your personal identifying information or PCI information. They can have pretty long tentacles into privacy and legal concerns. And as we've worked with this specifically, we want to make sure we're recognizing that this is a disaster for the business. And when we talk about disaster recovery, the way we've built the traditional disaster recovery platforms 3 years ago, 4 years ago, cannot necessarily solve these more modern disaster problems that need to be addressed when we talk about ransomware specifically. Looks like we got an answer on our poll. Cyber attack is the #1 from the responses. So good job. You're paying attention to what we're talking about at the very least. But I think that is a pretty common response. And, you know, most analysts would agree that at the very top of the existing business risks are cyber attacks. So I'm glad that most of you are agreeing with what we're talking about there. So when we talk about that modern disaster, you know, historically we've worried about things like hurricanes and citywide power outages, human error type things, hardware failures, all things that we can architect for with everything from high availability to fast recovery capabilities. When we talk about cyber attacks, we also need to consider the fact that when there's a threat actor involved, we actually have to worry about what's going to happen once that data is recovered. How do we make sure that it's secure, look for indicators of compromise, understand how they got in and prevent that from happening again, and return that organization back up to running their business as fast as possible and as safely as possible. And there's not been a really good complete solution for this historically. So what you see on the right-hand side of this slide are kind of 4 puzzle pieces that have been specifically talking about this problem for a little while now. And those are security tool providers, security service providers, recovery tool providers, and recovery service providers. And we kind of play in all of these spaces, but if you start as an organization to borrow tools and borrow puzzle pieces, if you will kind of continue the analogy, from different boxes, and you pull a puzzle piece from this box and this box and you put them together, you're not going to get a very good picture. They're not designed to necessarily go together. When we talk about specifically security tool providers, I want to tell a story about an organization. It was a manufacturing firm that was hit late on a Friday night. They had a traditional SIM monitoring in place, and the head of IT was the only one who was actually getting the alerts. He had gone on vacation and left earlier that day. And come Monday, the rest of the IT team came into all of their servers being down and encrypted. And it took them over 2 weeks to return to a place where they could run their manufacturing businesses again, because there weren't security operations in place or plans in place to know about that. Even with the tool there, it didn't succeed in accomplishing what they needed it to do. From a security service provider standpoint, you're thinking more around the security operations, the people and the process that go around those tools. Our own cybersecurity team once went to help with an incident response for a school organization that had been impacted, and they went and were helping them through the first parts of the remediation that needed to happen, and they went to look at their backups. And the most recent good backup was from deep into a previous semester. And if you think about running a school, all of the data that they had to recover from was actually from a time that didn't even matter. It didn't have the right students, it didn't have the right grades, the right classes. All of the data was too old to be useful. And they spent quite a bit of time actually rebuilding that. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the recovery side of things. And when we think about recovery tool providers, a lot of times we hear from the different vendors in this space about instant recovery in place. And that sounds really, really good when you're faced with some of those traditional disasters. But it doesn't actually help when your data center is a crime scene. And what I mean by that is when the data in your environment is going through forensics and legal's involved, maybe even law enforcement's involved, you don't necessarily always have the resources to power everything back on. We know about a security team that went to help a hospital, and their disaster recovery plan involved recovery back to their primary data center with that instant recovery technology. But they needed forensic work done on all of the production workloads, and so they had to remain powered on for several days, eating up all of the resources they needed to actually do that instant recovery plan. And because of that, they couldn't actually get the resources to do their restore for over a week. So they couldn't even begin their data recovery portion until the first week of that incident response was over. And finally, talking about service providers on the recovery side. Recovery is obviously a very important part of dealing with any disaster, but without the knowledge from a security operations team, it's going to fall flat as well in this space. So one financial firm we worked with didn't have the budget for a security operations team and was impacted with ransomware. And upon being encrypted, they enacted their disaster recovery plan and very quickly brought everything up from before the ransomware encrypted everything. They thought they had eliminated the threat by cleaning those machines with antivirus software, but they didn't understand the root point of compromise, meaning they didn't understand how the attacker really got in the first place. And by just picking it up and moving it to another place, they were attacked again in just a few weeks with a much more costly incident response. They had to dig in and understand that and invest in understanding that root point of compromise. And so as we started internally to tell these kind of war stories between security and recovery teams, we started to actually go through all of the different scenarios that we'd been in and try and understand what would have made the biggest difference as we tried to connect security and recovery. And when we did that, we built a technology and a process and a framework around the NIST, or National Institute for Standards and Technology, cybersecurity framework. And that framework has these 5 pillars across the top: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. We called this ransomware protection as a service. And the idea being that we wanted to be both proactive and protect environments from being impacted by cyber attacks as a modern disaster, but also be able to respond rapidly in the inevitability that there is no magic security, there is no silver bullet to stop this. And so we want to be able to use that data on the identify and protect side to also be able to detect, respond, and recover quickly. And what we decided, based off of all of the years of doing this, is that we needed to have a security operations center. This would include the technology to scan endpoints and networks and know what's happening, but also the people and the artificial intelligence and the process to detect, respond, make advisements, and understand what needed to happen based off of what was detected and what was being scanned. And so this comes with 24/7 dedicated security support for that security operations center side. And just like we talked about the puzzle pieces, we wanted to integrate our expertise as a disaster recovery provider and a backup provider. And so we merged both our backup capabilities and disaster recovery capabilities into what we call ransomware recovery as a service, which takes modern disaster recovery capabilities like immutable backup repositories, account gapping and air gapping to prevent attack services from bleeding over to disaster recovery sites, and modern disaster recovery operation processes to make sure that not only are we able to perform those recoveries into a secure site isolated from production, but threat hunt in those environments to perform any type of cleanup and search for indicators of compromise and make sure it's secure before things are brought back up online. And finally, the last component is the idea of a virtual CISO, or a security expert that can provide governance, security posture, and advice. Even in organizations where you've got an actual chief information security officer, want to make sure that we've got the ability to provide someone who understands this entire umbrella and has experience in dealing with lots of incidents to be able to provide the most important ability to mature the security process and provide very rapid incident response in the event of an attack. And it looks like Jennifer's already thrown up the next polling question, but if you haven't seen it, make sure you jump in and say, of those 5 pillars, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, which component of that cybersecurity framework do you believe needs the most attention in your organization? If you were to look and think about that framework and your ability to be both proactive and protect and identify what's actually there, and your ability to react to things that are happening, to detect, respond, and recover, where do you think the most attention is needed in your organization? And as we built out the 3 components of ransomware protection as a service, we combined all of the processes and procedures into one kind of workflow. This is a pretty sophisticated solution with lots of moving parts. And so we wanted to be able to offer organizations an umbrella way to handle this. And so we start very early with a total cost of development portion where we do a lot of discovery work. It's very obvious organizations have already invested in some of these components. And so we want to be able to help them as much as we can, utilize what they've already invested in, and then build a roadmap to full puzzle creation, right? The full ransomware protection as a service. And so we work with them and do joint engineering around that to get into this green circle that you see in the middle. The idea being that we're going to do testing. We want to make sure that all of the things that we build in that joint engineering phase work exactly as they're supposed to. And what that means is we need to do tabletop exercises with the vCISO, understand where our risks are, use the data from those tabletop exercises to move into disaster recovery testing and restore that data, run through the security operations of how they interface with the security operations center and perform those restores in a secure landing zone before they bring them online for end users to use. And then we use all of that data to build out playbooks and design different scenarios for how the disaster recovery team and the security team are going to respond to different types of incidents as they quickly handle any kind of event management. It's where you see the little golden circle out on the right-hand side, because we acknowledge even with all of these components in place, there is no silver bullet. And so we want to be able to make sure that we can rapidly respond and quickly come back into the green circle of health management, making sure everything's working as expected and continually improve. So I told you we were going to tell stories. So I'm going to jump into a few different places where this kind of process was extremely successful and what the outcomes look like there.
Hey, Adam.
Before I do that,
Yeah, before you do that, you want to jump over to the poll?
I do. I see the poll results.
Fabulous.
It looks like detect is the number one need. So we've got 12 was the highest number, it looks like, on detect. So that's pretty common to see, additional capabilities needed further on down on the reactive side. So not at all surprised by that. Not that there's a right or wrong answer there, but that's interesting. All right, first client outcome. I'm not going to give you any clients' names because we're dealing with a security service here, and honestly, no legal firm should be giving out names in these kind of scenarios, but there's some real interesting stories still that can be told. And in this specific story, this was a distribution company that was doing business in the Ukraine. During the Russian-Ukraine conflict, in fact, the very day that Russia invaded the Ukraine, they were hit. And our monitoring team detected the abnormal activity pretty quickly and moved to triage what was happening. There was a cyber attack identified, and the DR site was able to isolate the replication. So immediately we paused what was happening on the DR site. No new data is coming over. The security team was able to acknowledge that there was encryption that had happened on the production side. There was a ransom note that was found. And so they also were able to find what that suspected attack vector is, how the attacker actually got in. And so we were able to then use all of that data to recover very, very quickly. Disaster recovery was implemented in a little less than 2 hours. The organizations were brought back up on an isolated network, and the remediation for how that attacker got in was implemented. So the hole was no longer there before we brought everything back onto the network. And the rest of the indicators of compromise, the software that would have been put on there by the attacker was removed. And once it's reconnected, the end users were able to start using it again. This all happened in a matter of hours in one evening, and the forensic team went in and actually was able to review the production workloads over the next few days and make sure there was nothing else that we needed to know about. But because we were able to actually identify the attack vector and remediate very quickly, they were back up and running business the next day. There's very little actual impact to their business, and most of the organization didn't even know that this had happened. Second story I want to tell is about a retail organization. A nationwide retail chain that was attacked. One site, one business unit of that chain, their servers were taken offline late at night, and they thought they were going to lose 24 hours of online retail records because of their own legacy backup schedule, which took backups every night just after midnight, including the records of their online retail stores. They thought they were going to have to roll back to the previous night. They didn't have fresh backup from before the disaster, but they were using continuous data protection, specifically with Zerto in this story. And InterVision was able to go back and use a recovery point just before the attack. And so they didn't actually lose any of their retail records. And the organization was actually brought back up very, very quickly after that. Remediation occurred, and they were back up and running business the next day with absolutely no downtime to their retail stores. Third story I want to tell is around a mid-sized legal firm. In this, the attacker took down one of their business units' offsite servers and took out pretty much all of their file servers, all of their the data that they would use for their legal cases. And when the security team detected the attack, they worked with the recovery team for communication and response, let everybody know what was happening, isolated everything. And the client actually, in this case, began to restore their own data from backups. And there was, in this case, a separate security vendor. So it wasn't under the same umbrella of RPAS, but we did own the recovery portion of this specific component. And the recovery team was able to isolate the DR environment. And what we had to do, because there wasn't enough room in their production environment, was actually running a hybrid cloud method. And so the file servers, they had 3 very large file servers that they couldn't recover back into their production data center because they ran out of resources, very similar to the hospital story I told earlier. But in this case, because they had the DR site, they brought the 3 file servers up in our data center in just a matter of minutes, and then ran some network configurations to link the 2 sites. That was part of their disaster recovery playbook. And they actually ran in a hybrid cloud method for 2 weeks until they migrated the file servers back into production. The most important part of all 3 of these stories is after all of this was done, no ransoms are paid. They don't have to worry about one funding criminal enterprise losing money, but in most of these cases, there's no reputation loss either. And so in this last one, the client's cyber insurance paid for the cloud consumption to be running in that hybrid model for 2 weeks, and then the migration back to production. And let me tell you, that's significantly cheaper than the ransom that was requested. All right, one more poll question, Jennifer. We're going to ask which component of ransomware protection would add the most value to your organization's business or continuity, to your organization's business continuity plan. So I explained pretty high level what the 3 components are: security operations center as a service, endpoint detection and response, and managed detection and response combined into one service. The ransomware recovery portions, DRAS and BAS, and the virtual CISO for the governance, guidance, tabletop exercises, and further analysis and recovery. So if you were going to invest in something new that would provide the most value to your organization, which one of those 3 would you pick if you were to choose? While you're answering that question, I want to talk a little bit about why we think we're the best ones to be able to do a lot of this. We've been doing incident response and disaster recovery and security operations for a very long time. InterVision's got the ability to basically provide the entire info security color wheel: red team, yellow team, blue team, and everything in between to work together to solve problems. We've got our own VMware powered cloud, as well as some of the top cloud certifications across Amazon and Microsoft. And we have experience serving very high compliance clients in the medical field, financial services, and others that are in both high risk area and high compliance requirements. Our customer satisfaction is some of the highest out there. We've got independent ratings from G2 Crowd and Gartner Peer Insights, as well as our own net promoter scores, which are always very high. And we curate some of the best in breed technology. I haven't talked about tools a whole lot in this, and part of that is because there is not one magic button that every client should use this tool set, or every organization should install this. Sometimes there are all kinds of reasons to pick and choose the best for the outcomes your business needs. But these are some of the leading partners we utilize to provide the tools needed to put the people in the process on top of ransomware protection as a service in the bottom left-hand corner, including Veeam and Zerto from a recovery side, and from a security side, Arctic Wolf, Cisco, SentinelOne, CyberSafe are all fantastic partners in this space. And I mentioned the 3 cloud targets that we specifically use for disaster recovery. Finally, I'll say we put our money where our mouth is on this. Gartner's basically added 3 components around ransomware recovery specific to their disaster recovery purchasing guide. And InterVision's the only managed service provider that has a checkbox in all 3 of those components. Our SLAs include not only the availability and uptime, but recovery time objectives that include real security components. In fact, most of our organizations are able to hit under a 4-hour recovery time objective, compared to the industry standard of downtime that's caused by ransomware and cyber attacks of being closer to 20 to 21 days. 4 hours is pretty great. And then on top of that, with ransomware protection as a service, you get an incident response team that is in the trenches bringing you back up, included whenever there is a confirmed ransomware attack. So there's no need for an incident response payment on top of that. It's included. Looks like we got the results on the poll. Looks like recovery won the most needed. Again, no right answers, but the largest percentage of people who responded thought recovery was where they needed to invest the most. And so if any of those 3 components or the entire ransomware protection as a service makes sense to you, here's kind of the journey on how you get started for that discovery component that we talked about earlier when I was showing you our processes. And this is the 5 steps to get there. Right now, we're doing the introduction step. I'm telling you about our paths. I'm telling you why we think that ransomware is a modern disaster. The next step is discovery. We offer a free self-scoring cyber risk maturity assessment based on the NIST cybersecurity framework, those 5 pillars that I showed you earlier. It takes about an hour to fill out. It is pretty detailed, but if you pull your team together and fill that out, we have the ability to kind of come in and take that curated information that we have and provide you with a cyber risk maturity score and a total cost of ownership of not only what it would cost to do some of this yourself, but also where we can save you money. We find that usually we're saving organizations between 40 to 60% over our competition or trying to pull in these puzzle pieces themselves. Once we do that, we'll share our findings and work together to get to a place where we can build a roadmap to complete ransomware protection. And so if you want to do that, you can scan the QR code here on this last slide. It's pretty simple. There's just a little form to fill out, and we'll get someone with you to actually go and fill out that cyber risk maturity assessment. There is no cost in that. You can take that data back to your business and say, hey, here's our gaps. Let's fill it ourselves. Let's go talk to other people now that we think these are the gaps. And it's self-scoring. No one's got to get into your systems and look at your policies. It's not a deep assessment like something that would dive into all 100+ controls of the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it's a good place to start and understand kind of where you're at and level set where your biggest gaps are. With that, I'll open it up. Are there any questions, Jeff, or anyone else?
Hey, Adam. To our listeners, if you have questions, be sure and put them in the Q&A panel or in chat, and we will get to those. We do have a few that have come in already. So if my organization has already invested in a lot of security tools, can I still take advantage of ransomware protection? Are you able to work with those investments? And if so, how?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Jeff. So Absolutely. Ransomware protection is more of a framework than it is a specific prescriptive. You have to be using X tools with Y components. And a lot of our existing tools actually do a really good job of ingesting data from other security tools and utilizing other people's investments. So if you've already got something like an endpoint protection or some type of AI detection or even other managed detection and response capabilities, we kind of learn a lot of that on this cyber risk maturity assessment. And we're going to ask questions on there about what that's doing and what it's not doing and how it's working for you today so we can understand that and best fill that component out. But also understanding that, it may not be the right first place to invest for your organization. We saw the last poll. It looks like ransomware recovery is probably the biggest gap perceived by several of these people. And if that's the case, then we can come around and fill in the other gaps and help integrate with the security investments that you've made as well.
Well, and that's a great segue to our next question. We've got a viewer that has a DR plan already, and they had not made the connection between disaster recovery and ransomware recovery. How can they make sure that their DR plan incorporates a cyber attack?
Yeah, really good question. So the biggest thing, and the first place I'd start in that is doing a tabletop exercise. Again, I'll point back to the cyber risk maturity assessment because it's on the screen as an early free place to start, but to really kind of understand where your disaster recovery plan might fall down, get someone who's experienced in doing cyber attacks and incident responses to walk you through realistic scenarios. I can tell you a story where an organization went through lots and lots of disaster recovery testing, right? They knew their DR plan backward, forward, and upside down. They ended up experiencing an incident where the server that held all of their processes and procedures was attacked, and they lost access to their playbooks. And so, right off the bat, some of their own security operations, they were scrambling for, well, what do we do? Because the guidebook just got hacked, right? And so making sure you're catching the little details like that, because it's real easy with modern data replication tools to turn on your data in another place. But to actually talk through scenarios with an experienced security analyst who's doing actual incident response, they're going to have lots of those real world examples and talk through best practices to make sure little things like that don't happen.
Those tabletop exercises can really point out the gaps, and the more elaborate you make them, sometimes the more accurate and the more gaps that they start revealing. We've talked a lot about in the last 2 days about cyber insurance and its role and its increased complexity, increased cost. One of the things that this next question points to is that their cyber insurance company has added more requirements in order to get the coverage. What can they do to begin to meet those requirements, especially when it comes to protecting themselves from ransomware and cyber attacks?
Yeah, a lot of organizations will actually hand us some of those renewals and say, hey, help me fill these gaps, right? Check these boxes off. And there's a lot of those boxes included in our PAS. We found both the managed detection and response and the disaster recovery plan are often on those checklists in order to get renewed cyber insurance. There's a lot more, but InterVision's got an entire program around filling all of those specific controls that the cyber insurance companies are focused on, and doing it in a way that's more than just checking the box, but making sure that it's actually providing value around both the offense and defense side of security.
We've got another question that came in. This company says, we've experienced a few small ransomware attacks but their endpoint protection has contained the attack. It's not gone beyond a few endpoints, evidently. Do they really need more protection than just the endpoint?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. We've seen this a couple of times where they've got good endpoint protection. They're able to stop it at the workstation. Met one organization whose policy was literally if your workstation got hit with ransomware, they threw it in the trash. They wouldn't even try and reformat it and reconnect it. The paranoia was great enough that that one got thrown away and they deployed a brand new machine. But sometimes that can also be an indicator that there is someone testing the waters and trying to see what they can get away with. So we know with cyber attacks, there's what's called dwell time, where an attacker will find a way into an environment and then just kind of poke around and see what they can do and start exploiting specific users. And then when they find the right user with the right access, maybe they execute a larger attack to take things out. Modern managed detection and response, or XDR type technology, that's looking at the wire and seeing the movement and the unusual behavior, is definitely important above and beyond just looking at what's happening on the endpoint itself, in order to be able to recognize that kind of dwell activity and make sure that there's not someone in there who's just poking the edges. And, you know, in this case, maybe it's that, or maybe they're just getting lucky with these individual users clicking on something they shouldn't, but it being contained at the endpoint. But I would say absolutely they need something more than just endpoint protection.
Because it only takes once to get through the endpoint protection, right?
Yeah,
We were talking earlier about cyber insurance, and you mentioned a questionnaire, and a question has come in. This insurance questionnaire, is that part of the vCISO services, or is it a separate process document, and who is it available to?
So with the sales process itself and the discovery side of things, we'll absolutely help with those questionnaires. But the vCISO specifically is the best suited portion to help with this at a deeper level. They work hand in hand with a lot of insurance companies, and they've got a lot of experience working both with the legal teams, law enforcement, and boards to make sure they're meeting the requirements of all of the organizations that they report to, but also making sure that there's value in just checking those boxes.
So the questionnaire is not an InterVision questionnaire. It's coming from the insurance company.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It's every insurance company kind of has their own. You know, we've seen it be as small as like 4 controls. We've seen it go like 10 pages. Some of that was kind of an overreaction to some of the money that was lost in the insurance agencies when, you know, cyber attacks kind of ramped up over the last 4 years. But I think we're seeing some of that stabilize, but they're still kind of picking specific controls, and they seem to be using either CIS or NIST cybersecurity controls to specifically harness. These are the things you have to do in order to become insurable against cyber attacks.
Are there some commonalities, Adam, that you've seen? The insurance, something that is a couple of areas where they're picking on heavily?
Yeah, so I mentioned already that MDR and disaster recovery are pretty heavily required. In addition to that, advanced identity access policies, making sure multi-factor authentication is required on everything, as well as advanced patching capabilities, making sure that vulnerability management is 100% taken care of.
You talked on one of your slides specifically on the recovery side, and I found it interesting in the poll question that recovery is where people still feel the need, that's where they need to invest. And on one of your slides, you had the different targets. Can you talk a little bit more about the targets that are supported and maybe the differences between them?
Yeah, I can. I'll point out too before I jump into that. You mentioned recovery being the pull winner there on the last one. We've seen a weird swing where several organizations we've worked with have taken away from their disaster recovery budget, pushed it into their security budget, and then left themselves hanging on the recovery side. And so I've talked to people on both sides of that who like we need a balance here that's not happening. And so that's kind of happened specifically around ransomware protection. As far as the three targets that you can go to from a VMware, AWS, or Azure side of things, often what organizations will do, and this makes them a lot of sense, is understand what their cloud migration strategy looks like. Do they already have investments in one of these clouds? Or are they looking to protect data in one of these clouds? Most, when we look at AWS and Azure, they both charge for egress costs. And so sending data back out of that cloud is pretty expensive. And so if they're already protecting data in those clouds, what we'll often do is utilize a different region within that cloud investment to protect their data that's both on-prem and in the cloud. And so when we think about data in the cloud, we think it's very secure. We think it's very reliable because high availability is a thing, and it is. But we can't ignore the fact that cyber threats still exist. And when data is breached in the cloud, it doesn't matter how high available it is. In fact, the more high available it is, the larger the attack surface is. And so once an attacker's in, the high availability doesn't save you in any way, shape, or form. You've got to have something in another region that's gapped from an account standpoint, meaning that no one with access to that production environment can use that same credentialing system to log into disaster recovery. And so it's immutable, it's protected by different accounts, and it's able to be recovered when and if something happens in that first region. But when it comes to AWS and Azure, they kind of stand alone on their own independent capabilities, but it really depends on where that organization's made investment. Now, a VMware powered cloud has an advantage that if you're coming from a VMware powered cloud, there's no conversion. And so it's very, very fast at this point in time. And there are lots of technologies to do this, but to stand up another VMware powered cloud, you can still utilize the advantages of consumption-based cloud in that VMware powered cloud without paying for powered on resources in your DR environment, and get all of the advantages of price and scale and accessibility, but also get a lot of speed because you're not converting. When we go from something like a VMware environment into AWS or a VMware environment into Azure, we're going to run into the issue of that conversion that has to happen. So because it's a new hypervisor, a new technology, that conversion is going to take a little bit of time. It's still very quick, but it's not going to be as fast as the VMware side.
So you're trading off maybe a little bit on your recovery time objective.
You are.
Yeah. We've got another question that came in. We have a CISO at our organization. Can we take advantage of the other parts of RPAS if we have an in-house CISO?
Yeah, you absolutely can, for sure. In fact, most of the CISOs that we talk to, when they meet our vCISO team, they're usually really excited to get someone who's got a lot of experience working with other organizations in their specific field, around the types of things that they run into. And so even a really well-experienced CISO can get advantages not only from the recovery and the SOC as a service side, but we'll often still at least do like a one-off engagement here and there with our vCISO team just to kind of polish their own understanding and grow their capabilities as they put those puzzle pieces together inside their own environment.
Yeah, I think there's a real advantage, as you say, to connect CISO to CISO, right?
Right.
And talk shop, but also be aware of what the vCISOs are seeing in a broader landscape. Adam, thank you so much for carving out time to join us on the 2023 Spring Strategy Summit. For our viewers, check out that cyber assessment and start digging into your ransomware protection because it is one of those areas that maybe we forget about that cyber attack can really impact us. And while we know the threat is real, taking the steps to make sure that we've got that recovery piece in place can be huge. So, Adam, thank you very much.